the chemical being in some of James and John's food seasoning felt really sus. It undoubtedly wasn't merely intended to deter vermin. But at the time, police officers weren't sure what to make of the food. They were just glad they hadn't eaten any of it. To police, the recently fired shotgun they found in James's room with the one spent shell casing was slightly more interesting than the strychnine in the cupboard. But even that clue was boggling because there was no blood in the house that indicated a shooting had occurred. The officers found zero evidence that anyone had bled or been injured inside James's room where the gun, spent casing, and drag marks were all found. There was also no blood anywhere else in the house. Unable to make sense of what happened, the police focused on trying to get some answers from James himself. But while they were traveling to Mansfield to get his remains to a pathologist for an autopsy, they found John's horse, Thelma, running free out in the open in an area known as Howitt Plains. I'm not exactly sure how the authorities knew Thelma was John's horse as compared to some other horse running around, but my best guess is that maybe she had a branding on her. I don't know. But still, all the source material says the loose horse was determined to be John's. However, because animals can't talk, finding Thelma wasn't really all that helpful to the investigators. They still didn't know where John was. So they kept going and eventually got to Mansfield to deliver James's body to a doctor who conducted an autopsy. That examination revealed that James had died from a single gunshot wound to his back. Articles by the Mail and Sunday Times specifically say there were 15 or 16 shotgun pellets in his back. There was no evidence from his remains that he'd suffered from strychnine poisoning, so any theory that a potential poisoning had been involved pretty much ended there. Based on everything I read in the source material, it seems the police chalked up the strychnine in the pantry at the house as something that was solely meant for deterring vermin, and actually had no relevance to the murder. What police were confident in, though, was that James had been murdered. The only thing they needed to find out was who had pulled the trigger. It was apparent from the state of his body that James had been dead for weeks, and that allowed investigators to narrow down the window of time in which they believed he'd been killed. They assumed that James was probably already dead when Harry first visited the station on January 22nd, which was why neither he nor John had answered the door. But for James to be as badly decomposed as he was when he was eventually found in late February, that meant he'd likely been killed sometime in late December or early January. And the big question police knew they needed to answer was when was the last time anyone had seen James alive? To help with the timeline, investigators turned to a handful of men. A pair of brothers with the last name Gould, who were traveling through Howitt High Plains, as well as a shopkeeper named Albert Stout, who lived in the small town of Talbotville, about 20 miles away from Wanangata Station. Strange Company reported that Albert said John and James had stayed with him on the night of December 20th, 1917, after traveling to Talbotville together to cast their votes in a public referendum election. Articles by Strange Company and the Sydney Theatre Company state that the referendum the men were voting on had to do with whether Australia could enact a draft during wartime. All of the source material I read that mentioned this referendum election say both John and James voted the same way on the matter, but whether they were for or against conscription remains unknown. No one seems to have been able to gather that information. And I mean, I guess we're talking about these men's personal votes in an election, so I'm not even sure it matters. But my point is, regardless of how they voted on the issue, it's clear that they were both in agreement on the matter, which means it's unlikely they were bitter toward one another on the topic and would have gotten into an argument about it or whatever. Anyway, Albert Stout told the police that after voting, John and James stayed the night with him in Talbotville, and the next morning, December 21st, he saw them leave together, headed back in the direction of Wanangata Station. Before they left, James told Albert that the crops they were growing at the station wouldn't be ready to cut until at least mid-January. Now, that information about the crops being cut is an important detail when it comes to establishing a clear timeline in the case. We know from Harry Smith's account on January 22nd that he said when he arrived, he noticed the crops were cut. And if James told Albert when he saw him on December 21st that the crops wouldn't be ready until mid-January, that likely means James and John cut the crops sometime between January 1st and January 22nd. There's no way to know for sure, but I think it's probably unlikely they lied to Albert about the crops being ready because he very well could have been a potential buyer of their product. None of the source material says one way or the other whether the crops at the station could be harvested by one person, but I think it's safe to say that it would probably have taken the strength and labor of both John and James to cut the crops. I personally think James was killed after the crops were cut, and because no one was around by January 22nd, that would put the window of James's murder sometime in early or mid-January 1918. One reason I'm convinced of this timeline is because of an article I read by Harry's Hut, which cites historical documents and personal diary entries. The piece explains that on December 28, 1917, two men who are referred to as the Gould brothers traveled within 5 miles of Wanangata Station. These guys said as they passed by, they heard two men's voices in the distance, mixed with a dog barking. At the time, the Goulds figured the sounds they were hearing were John James and James's dog Baron. The brothers said that when they eventually arrived at the front door of the homestead, they didn't see anyone inside or hanging around. So they left a note to let James and John know they were passing through the property and were planning to camp nearby on the Wanangata River. The Gould brothers never went back to the station and eventually made their way downriver to Eaglevale, where Harry Smith lived. So based on the Gould brothers' diary entries, Albert Stout's story, and Harry Smith's information, police investigating James's murder realized that most likely James had been killed sometime in either late December at the earliest or mid-January at the latest. Because authorities hadn't started working the case until March, though, that meant a lot of time had passed. Time they could not get back. But surprisingly, the police didn't seem too worried about this fact. You see, the theory they'd been convinced of pretty much from the moment they learned James had been murdered was that someone who knew him, or at least was familiar with the area of the station, had killed him. The one person who checked all those boxes was John Bamford, and he was nowhere to be found, which meant he was suspect number one. Shopify's already taken the cash register online, helping millions sell billions around the world. But did you know that Shopify can do the same thing at your retail store? Give your point-of-sale system a serious upgrade with Shopify. Shopify POS is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. With Shopify, you get a powerhouse selling partner that effortlessly unites your in-person and online sales into one source of truth. Track every sale across your business in one place and know exactly what's in stock. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Do retail right with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/parkpredators, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/parkpredators to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/parkpredators.
NetCredit is here to say yes to a personal loan or line of credit when other lenders say no. Apply in minutes and get a decision as soon as the same day. If approved, applications are typically funded the next business day or sooner. Loans offered by NetCredit and lending partner banks and serviced by NetCredit. Application subject to review and approval. Learn more at netcredit.com/partner. NetCredit. Credit to the people.
According to multiple in-depth articles on John Bamford, as well as a detailed chapter in Keith Layden and Michael Ray's book, The Wanangata Mystery, John was rumored to be kind of a loner. Some people even described him as a, quote, surly and hot-tempered man that most folks avoided if they could. An article by Harry's Hut reported that people who heard of John thought of him as a man who'd get into fights easily, or who was just the kind of guy that sulked around, plotting spiteful retaliation against those who challenged him. And something that contributed greatly to this characterization of John was an incident that happened years before James Barclay's murder. John's wife, a woman named Charlotte Blair, had died under, we'll call it sudden circumstances, while the couple was living in a hut in Blacksman Creek. According to that article by Harry's Hut I mentioned a second ago, which references historical indexes from professional historian Helen Doxford Harris, Charlotte died from a violent epileptic fit in the middle of the night on November 5th, 1898, while sleeping next to John. A constable's report from the incident details how John and one of his neighbors tried for 15 minutes to revive Charlotte, but were unable to save her. At the time, John and Charlotte had both left their previous spouses and were living together. Most of the source material says they were married, but some historical documents don't specify if they were still married to their previous spouses when they got hitched, or if they sought formal divorces or what. Either way, married or not, they were together and were new parents to a 7-month-old daughter named Violet. And if that wasn't tragic enough, Charlotte was just a few months pregnant with their second child, and she passed away. John told the investigating constable that in the days leading up to Charlotte's death, he and their neighbors had overheard Charlotte saying she'd been having severe headaches, but hadn't taken any kind of medication for them. The constable indicated in his report that Charlotte's headaches may have had something to do with her being pregnant, but what was truly causing them was never determined because no doctor ever performed an autopsy on Charlotte. Shortly after she died, authorities concluded nothing was amiss about her death. There were no signs of physical trauma on her body or blood inside her and John's residence. So the police labeled the whole thing as a freak health thing, and they didn't investigate her death any further. John buried her at Dargo, and life went on. Not long after that, though, rumors started to spread that maybe the police shouldn't have been so quick to close the case. Authorities received a letter from a man named Oscar Messenger, stating that John might have had something to do with Charlotte's untimely and sudden death, and detectives needed to probe the issue more. Now, it's important to note that in the constable's report, he wrote that Oscar was a well-known adversary of John's and was pretty much a busybody who'd been telling anyone who would listen that he thought John had murdered Charlotte. Despite there being zero proof, that's what happened. Police investigators who were asked to look into the matter wanted nothing to do with this bad blood between Oscar and John. And according to the reporting by Harry's Hut, the investigating officers completely disregarded Oscar's accusations against John. But the damage Oscar's words did to John's reputation lingered long after their feud fizzled. Because Oscar had maligned John so much, eventually people who didn't even know John started to believe some of the bad things that were being said about him. People who knew him or who had grown up with him tried to refute the terrible rumors, but by the start of the early 20th century, and definitely by 1918, the rough, hardened, angry guy description that had been preceding John just stuck. Which is why police investigating James's murder in 1918 were so quick to make John their prime suspect. I mean, for one thing, he was missing, which was kind of a strike against him. Plus, he was the only other person known to be at Wanagata Station at the same time as James. And again, he was allegedly known to be quick-tempered. Police theorized that perhaps the two men had argued over something, and John snapped and killed James. They quickly buried his body and fled. John's room being in a state of disarray and him possibly taking off on his horse without the presence of mind to saddle it were two things that investigators at the time thought kind of pointed to this scenario. In fact, the authorities were so convinced at one point this is what happened, they offered a reward worth £200 for information that could lead to John's arrest. He was considered a fugitive, and law enforcement across Victoria was determined to find him. Unfortunately, the search for John dragged on. During that time, James's family laid him to rest in a cemetery in March, but the manhunt for John continued and continued. The authorities spent months tracking down and investigating reported sightings of John throughout Victoria, but all of them were dead ends. It wasn't until November 7, 1918, almost a year after James's murder, that the police got a major break. But it wasn't exactly the update they were expecting. According to Peter McCullough's article for Peninsula Essence and a piece published for Harry's Hut, the police constable who was in charge of working James's case along with Harry Smith and two other men named William Hearn and Jim Fry, were out searching in Howett Plains when they came across a grisly scene. While combing the area, William stumbled upon something odd tucked beneath a pile of logs outside of a small abandoned hut. He'd seen a man's boot poking out from underneath the wood, and when he alerted the others, they all began to dismantle the pile to see the rest of the body. When they pulled several logs aside, they realized the corpse was John Bamford. Not long after making the discovery, more police officers arrived and transported John's body to a doctor in Dargo, who performed an autopsy. That John had been shot in the left side of his head with a revolver, and the bullet that killed him was still lodged in his skull. Coverage by the Mail indicates that the caliber of the slug may have been a match to James's missing handgun. However, that gun was not found anywhere around John's body. It's also worth noting that no other research material except that article by the Mail mentions the detail that the bullet found in John could have been a ballistics match to James's missing gun. Finding John dead didn't clear him as a suspect in James's murder, though. Far from it. The police were still super convinced that James and John had gotten into a fight at the Wanagata homestead, and John had overpowered James and shot him. They theorized that perhaps overwhelmed by guilt, John took off in a hurry after burying James's body, and eventually died by suicide near the abandoned hut in Howett Plains. But there were two big problems with that theory. The first is that there was no weapon found around John's body, and if you'll remember, he was buried beneath a pile of logs, which in my mind screams that he had to have been killed by someone else and then put there. I mean, it's hard to imagine that John put himself under those logs after taking his own life. It just doesn't make sense. And eventually the police realized how unlikely this scenario was too, and dropped the whole John died by suicide idea. The second issue with that theory is that John was a much smaller man than James. Most of the source material describes James as a tall, strong man. John was several years older and much shorter. So it was difficult for anyone, including the police, to really buy into the notion that John had been able to move James's body to his makeshift grave near the creek. Over the years, historians and writers have considered a variety of theories as to who could be responsible for the two men's murders. And the big questions that have surfaced are, were James and John killed by mutual friends? Were they killed by a band of robbers? Was someone they knew involved? The answers are hard to come by. We're talking about more than 100 years of history and clues, many of which have been lost to time. But even though I don't have enough time in this episode to do a complete deep dive into every theory that's been thrown out there over the past century, I'll at least go through a few of them that I think are worth considering and have been studied by historians and authors. And one of the scenarios paints the beloved figure of this entire story, James Barclay, in a completely different light.
Hello, driver. It's me, your oil change light, here to ruin your day. Remember that last mechanic who sold you stuff you didn't need and took 3 long, boring hours? Did you trust him? Do you trust anyone anymore? What do I know? I'm just a light.
Silence your oil change anxiety at Valvoline Instant Oil Change, where we give you a stress-free oil change in about 15 minutes. Valvoline Instant Oil Change. Service you can see, experts you can trust.
Whether you're a morning person or a bedtime procrastinator, everyone deserves a mattress that works for their style. And you'll find the best mattress for you at Ashley. The new Temper-Adapt collection at Ashley brings you one-of-a-kind body-conforming technology, making every sleep tailored to be your best. The collection also features cool-to-the-touch covers and motion absorption to help minimize sleep disruptions from partners, pets, or kids. Shop the all-new Temper-Adapt collection at Ashley, in-store, online at ashley.com. Ashley, for the love of home.
The first theory that most historians believe is plausible and explains why and how James and John died is that someone from their past or current social circle when they were killed had something to do with their murders. I've already told you a lot about John's history and how people had varying perceptions and opinions of him. He clearly had a few enemies and doubters about whether he might have killed his wife, but it's important to note that none of the source material attributes any of those things as to why he was killed. Peter McCullough reported for Peninsula Essence that James, who most of the source material seems to herald as the better of the two men, was also a bit of a troublemaker. McCullough wrote that growing up, James frequently got into fights and interacted with the police. He was even busted for arson at one point when he was a teenager. Apparently, his bouts of bad behavior created a lot of friction between him and his father, and it seems there were many years James didn't contact or have much of a relationship with his family at all. As a young man, he spent a few years trying to strike it rich as a gold prospector, but ended up settling for more steady work, shearing sheep, performing manual labor, and trading cattle and horses. When James was about 40 or 41 years old, he married a 19-year-old woman named Lizzie, who he'd gotten pregnant out of wedlock, and none of his family attended the wedding. Less than a year later, Lizzie gave birth to their son, James Jr., but then she died of tuberculosis shortly thereafter. McCullough reported that eventually James sent young Jim Jr. to live with one of his aunts so he could pursue a career working as a full-time cattle trader, which eventually led him to connect with Arthur Phillips and end up managing Wanangata Station. What's important about James ending up in the position he held at the homestead is that it gave him access to a lot of land and information about who was successfully trading in the cattle business. Some authors have speculated that maybe James's competitive nature and his desire to be as successful as one of his brothers, who was a wealthy orchardist, might have pushed him to begin stealing cattle from other rustlers. However, it should be noted that there is little to no evidence this took place. In fact, most people who spoke about James, including his boss, Arthur Phillips, said this kind of activity would have been completely out of character for him. Another theory about what might have happened to James and John has to do with two of the oldest motives in the book: love and jealousy. You see, according to several articles, it was long believed that James Barclay had his fair share of relationships with women, some unmarried, some married. I already told you about his significantly younger wife, Lizzie, who was 19 when she married James when he was in his 40s. And I know age is just a number, and maybe back in the early 1900s, no one batted an eye at this kind of age gap. But still, it stood out to me. Well, it turns out that after Lizzie died, James was said to have gotten involved with another woman, who was married. This woman's name was Annie Klingsborn, and according to Peter McCullough's reporting for Peninsula Essence and author Wallace Mortimer, Annie's husband Robert was not too happy about the tryst his wife carried on with James, and allegedly enlisted the help of one of his brothers to teach James a lesson. Not a lot of information is out there, though, about the details of how all of this was said to have gone down, so it's hard to pinpoint if there is really anything substantial to this theory. Some of the source material goes back and forth as to whether James and Annie were even romantically involved with one another. So I'm not sure what to think about this whole jealous husband, murdered James scenario. Wallace Mortimer wrote in his book, Who Killed James Barclay, that it's possible the entire thing was just a nasty rumor spread by someone who wanted to ruin Annie's reputation. It's worth noting, though, that in a rare interview during the 1970s, Jim Jr., James's son, told novelist Wallace Mortimer, quote, "It was all a long time ago, and both the murderers are long since dead. I can't see that anything can be gained now. It's all best forgotten." End quote. To me, that statement would indicate that Jim Jr. had figured out at some point in his life who had murdered his dad. According to a conversation William Mortimer said he had with Jim Jr. before Jim Jr. died in 1987, Jim Jr. said that his father had been killed by a jealous husband and that jealous husband's brother, a fact which could never be proven or even investigated since everyone who might have been culpable was long dead. Additional speculation with quite a bit of historical documentation to support it comes from an article published by Harry's Hub. It explains that James Barclay had grown increasingly worried that someone in the cattle business was after him. He'd been working in Wanangata Valley for several years prior to his death, and according to at least one letter he wrote to a friend, he claimed he'd received, quote, "a threatening letter," end quote, which caused him to be concerned about his safety. Apparently this issue was so worrisome to James that he visited the town of Mansfield to buy a handgun, which I presume is the same gun that the police believe was stolen from his bedroom. Harry Smith would later tell people that before the murder, James always armed himself with his gun while working on the property. After James's death, Harry made sure to keep 2 guns in his house loaded when he slept at night. Now, I don't want to speculate too much about this next theory because other than what I just mentioned, there's pretty much no other documentation or evidence out there to support it. But where my mind goes is to those stolen receipts from his checkbook, that missing suit, the missing handgun, and the razor. Like, what is all of that about? I mean, if the motivation for this crime was personal or in some way targeting James, then why would the killer also steal a bunch of random stuff from him after killing him? I mean, if your intent is to eliminate him, then why do you also want to rob him of such trivial stuff? According to all the articles that mention the stolen checks, the police determined that none of them ever resurfaced or were used. Which then, of course, forces me to ask, why even steal them in the first place? And then there's the fact that John was killed too. So, I mean, was he murdered because he was a witness? Technically, we don't even really know which of the 2 men were murdered first. I think it's natural to assume James was killed first, since his body was discovered first. But I mean, when it comes down to it, both of their bodies were in varying states of decomposition when they were found. John's remains weren't found until 10 months after James. So who knows if the doctors who did their autopsies were even able to determine which one of them was killed first. I don't know, there are just so many unanswerable questions, and honestly my mind could spin on this all day long, but let's move on. Another theory I've come across that's been batted around for years is that thieves who were dead set on stealing some of the cattle James oversaw at Wanangata Station committed the murders. The problem is that after the men's bodies were found, the owners of the station determined that none of their cattle was missing from the property. Like I mentioned earlier, there were no signs of a shooting or struggle inside the house, which meant if thieves did come onto the property and an assault took place, it didn't happen inside the homestead. And a clue that doesn't make sense in that scenario is how James's shotgun and the empty casing ended up in his bedroom. Like, if that's the suspected murder weapon in his murder, or a weapon that he may have used to defend himself, then why was it in his bedroom? Why wasn't it wherever he got killed? None of it makes sense. The only bit of information I could find that points to a roaming thieves did it scenario was addressed by Wallace Mortimer in his book, Who Killed Jim Barclay, and in an article by the Mail which was published in 1950. Wallace wrote that there was another cattleman in the area named Jack Beveridge, who had a younger brother named James Beveridge. James Beveridge had a reputation for being a bit of an outlaw, and as a way to avoid his trouble, he decided to live in remote Wanangata Valley. He was said to be there in 1917. At some point, it's believed that James Beveridge may have begun to steal cattle from James Barclay. And because James Barclay branded his animals with the initials JB, and James Beveridge's older brother Jack also branded his animals with the letters JB, it was really easy for James Beveridge to steal from Wanangata Station without anyone being the wiser. Wallace Mortimer wrote that he thinks it's likely that James Barclay found out about this switcheroo James Beveridge was pulling, and then James Beveridge decided to kill James Barclay and John Bamford over it. Reporting by the Mail said that on 2 separate occasions in 1917, unknown cattle rustlers had raided 2 herds that grazed next to Wanangata Station's cattle. So maybe this theory isn't that outrageous. A variation of this theory suggests maybe over a period of time, James Barclay discovered a different group of rogue cattlemen were stealing animals from his station. And so he looped in John to make sure he was aware of the situation and he could be on the lookout for any unusual happenings. Historians have speculated that maybe whoever James Barclay suspected was behind the theft found out he was going to report them to the police and killed him before he had the chance. In that scenario, it's likely the killer's reason for slaying John Bamford, in addition to James, was because John was collateral damage. Like maybe he was a witness to them murdering James, or because, as an employee of the station, he knew too much. The last and final theory that's been floated over the years suggests that Harry Smith might have been involved in these murders. According to the Peninsula Essence article I've referenced a few times in this episode, which was written by Peter McCullough, Harry visited the station twice, once in January 1918 and again in February 1918. And each time, he said he never saw James or John. He was also part of the search parties who found both men's bodies. And perhaps most suspicious of all is that before John's body was even found, Harry claimed to have had a dream that John had been killed and buried in Howett High Plains, right near the abandoned hut and log pile. Seems kind of convenient, right? I mean, if someone is claiming they've had a dream about where someone is killed and buried, and then that person they were talking about is actually found dead beneath a pile of logs at that exact location, that's gonna be a red flag to me. It's just odd. And thankfully this fact didn't go unnoticed by the authorities back in 1918. Following the discovery of John's body, the police took a hard look at Harry as a potential suspect in his murder. They wondered if maybe Harry John Bamford had murdered James, and in retaliation for killing his friend, Harry had exacted revenge on John. What police doubted, though, was that Harry would have then left his friend James's body out in the elements in a shallow grave to be ravaged by animals and the environment. That fact just didn't add up for investigators who were evaluating Harry as a suspect. In the end, Harry was cleared of any suspicion, and the authorities never charged him with anything related to these murders. He went on to employ James's son, Jim Jr., and after Harry died in 1945, he left all his property to Jim Jr. Did he leave this inheritance to Jim Jr. out of guilt? Sure, it's possible. Did he do it just to be a nice guy and provide for a young man who'd lost his mother to disease and his father to murder? Of course, that's possible too. So,
the calls for a ceasefire may be quieting on college campuses, but they're getting louder around the world.
The level of human suffering is catastrophic, and that's why, Mr. Speaker, we need an immediate ceasefire.
The International Court of Justice called on Israel to immediately halt its offensive in Rafah. That came a few days after Spain, Norway, and Ireland recognized an independent Palestinian state, and a few days before, an Israeli airstrike in Rafah Sunday killed dozens of Palestinian refugees.
Civilians burned alive and children decapitated.
Israel says the strike was a tragic mishap, but that it killed 2 Hamas officials. But the top Hamas leadership remains intact. And therein lies the paradox. Israel wants to take out top leadership, all while negotiating with said leadership remains essential to a ceasefire. On Today Explained, we're finally going to talk about who's running Hamas.
I don't know if you've been on Facebook lately, but it is a mess. There's AI spam everywhere, and most of it is weirdly religious.
Jesus in all of his forms are very common. It's like Jesus with a birthday cake next to deformed children. There's also a lot of Jesus with ripped men, like just really strong, like bodybuilder types, and as well as with hot flight attendants.
I'm Taylor Lorenz, and this week on Power User, we'll talk about what it means when one of the defining social networks of our time becomes an AI spam graveyard, and who's behind it all.
I think we can all agree the current political moment is fraught. But how does it compare to the other fraught political moments in history?
It felt for a time, in part of that decade, like everything was falling apart. Young people against old people, anti-war violence, peace movement.
I'm former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, and this week, presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin joins me on my podcast, Stay Tuned with Preet. We talk about difficult times in America's history and how its people overcame them. The episode is out now. Search and follow Stay Tuned with Preet wherever you get your podcasts.
أنتم تسمعون لتفسير اليوم.
You're listening to Today Explained.
Tom O'Connor writes about national security and foreign policy for Newsweek. He joined us to talk about the 3 guys at the top of the Hamas org chart. Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif, who are believed to be in Gaza, and Ismail Haniyeh, who is known to be in Doha, Qatar. We started with Sinwar.
The last we've seen of him is a video that was released a few months ago, I believe, by the Israelis.
We're releasing a footage of the mass murder
and mastermind behind the Hamas massacre of October 7th in Sinwar.
Purported to be him. It looks like him with some family members going through a tunnel.
This video is one of many that we have obtained since October 7th.
All three of them, including Hani, are really from the same generation of children born into refugee families in Gaza that escaped from other parts of what was before the Mandate of Palestine, before the 48 war. They grow up in the 80s at a time where Gaza is under Israeli military occupation. They get arrested by Israel. They get out and they rise up the ranks of the group. So to start really with Sinwar, he's also known as Abu Ibrahim in Arabic, born in Khan Yunis. He goes to the Islamic University of Gaza, like all these three guys do essentially. And pretty early on in the 80s, he's arrested the first time, and we have to remember the 80s is a very tense time in the Gaza Strip. The first Intifada, which is a mass uprising, there's violence everywhere.
It's absolutely clear that the commitment is not only to regain Palestinian homeland for PLO, the commitment is to do it by armed force.
And this is really when Hamas forms, and it gets its support base from these disaffected Palestinian activists who become increasingly conservative and religiously focused in their their activities. So Sinwar is arrested once. I think the first time is in 1982. He has a few run-ins with the police and basically the Israeli security forces at the time, but he really gets this reputation when he comes out as this really brutal enforcer, and he's known for not only killing Israelis, but he's also accused of killing Palestinians that are accused of collaborating with Israel. So he's arrested once again in the late 80s, and this time he stays in prison for a long time, and he doesn't really emerge again actually till about 2011.
Israel has begun transferring Palestinian prisoners ahead of their planned release in an exchange deal for the captive Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit.
There's this big exchange, about 1,000 Palestinians, Sinwar being one of them.
I'm still a soldier, and I will continue with my nephews on the battlefield. I have been absent for 25 years, so there are many things I need to learn.
Hamas is running the show in Gaza. He's basically part of what has become now Hamas's internal security forces. He's doing these interrogations, and he's also doing something else that's very important. He's building ties with this axis of resistance that includes Hezbollah, includes Iran, and some of the other groups in the region, are really tied together by the IRGC. And that's important because Hamas and Iran have had kind of complicated relationship over time. The Sunni-Shia divide has informed the relationship, the Syrian civil war, but this relationship starts to blossom a bit. And then in 2017, he is promoted to the chief of affairs in Gaza, and he's really seen obviously as the key figure in terms of organizing, in terms of leading Hamas in the Gaza Strip itself.
And also, potentially underground somewhere, is Mohammed Deif.
Yeah, so Mohammed Deif is a far more elusive figure than Sinwar. Now, Sinwar, he was public. He was out there. He went to events. He went to rallies. He dared, Israel on occasions to assassinate him. Mohammed Deif has pretty much lived in the shadows for much of his life. He's the product of a refugee family that lived in Gaza. He went to university in the 80s. Funny enough, he actually had an extracurricular activity. He actually took on theater. Not what you'd expect maybe from your top Islamist militant commando, but he's held by the Israelis for I think about a year and a half or so. And when he emerges, he really quickly becomes essentially one of the founding forces within the emerging Al-Qassam brigades, which really start to take root in the 1980s. And his claim to fame really is just excelling in bomb-making skills and strategy and ambushes. And he's really seen as one of the key figures behind the scenes when it came to these mass attacks going into even after the first Intifada, there was second Intifada in the 2000s. And in 2002, the head of the Al-Qassam brigade, Salah Shahada, is killed, and Mohammed Deif essentially takes his place. So Mohammed Deif, as far as his background itself, less is known about him. The name, actually, Mohammed Daif, is not his real name. It's a nickname that refers to, the term Daif means guest in Arabic, and it refers to the fact that he never stays in the same place for too long. And he's really been a major target for Israeli assassination attempts and airstrikes. He's escaped a number of attempts on his life, but he's also, as far as we know, he's lost an eye, he's lost other limbs. We know that he's been severely injured. That's part of the reason, perhaps, why we don't see a lot of him. I think there's really only maybe 2 or 3 photos ever released of him, actually. But he's also lost family members in some of these attacks too, we know. So he is a dedicated commando leader, and he's almost like a Che Guevara kind of figure. He's become so iconic in ways that even just his silhouette, which is usually how he presents himself, like he did on October 7th when he gave this super galvanizing speech, but the silhouette is being raised at rallies and stuff like that. So certainly a very influential figure.
Okay, so that covers the leadership we think is inside Gaza. What about leadership outside of Gaza? What about Hania?
Yeah, so Hania really today serves as the top leadership of all Hamas, as the chief of the Politburo. He's in Doha, based there. He travels. He's part of the public face of Hamas. He's pivotal to their international relations and their efforts to have more international legitimacy to forge relations with other countries, other powers.
According to reports, Ismail Hania will be meeting with Egypt's spy chief to discuss stopping the aggression in the besieged enclave and an agreement for the release of prisoners.
And he is seen as always been seen as more of a political figure for Hamas. He was actually a former prime minister of the Palestinian National Authority at this brief time where there was a unity government. Hania is no longer considered, of course, prime minister, but he assumes control over Gaza, and then he, of course, then goes on to become the head of all Hamas. So that's really his position right now. He's, again, super important to the formal leadership structure of the group. He's not necessarily, calling every single shot in Gaza itself. Hamas has structured itself in a way to function quite autonomously from even the battalion level.
How important, how essential are these 3 guys to Hamas? How much would it change Hamas's strategy, presence, if they were found or killed or arrested?
Yeah, so, there's no doubt that there's both symbolic and tactical, value in taking out top Hamas leaders, But if we look at the history of Hamas, they've lost just about every top leader they've had, over the years, and they've had new people. I mentioned, Mohammed Daif, he came in because Salah Shahada was killed. So it's not to say that these guys haven't, and the group itself, let's say, doesn't have this organizational experience in filling these ranks, and that's something, again, that they say. I've talked to senior Hamas officials who said that we feel it when they kill our leaders. They do, because these people, not only are they not only do they have this influence and this public image, they also have contacts, they know people, there's a reason that they rose up the ranks of the group itself. But they have people in waiting. They have replacements, and they have replacements for the replacements. We've heard that a lot. So, I think that, and this is something, Israeli officials tell us, is that, yes, we want to get these guys, they're on our target list, and we've seen them, do these assassination operations for some of these guys who are abroad, like Aruri, for example, but they're not setting the deaths or the capture of these top officials as a prerequisite for claiming victory. Until there's, I think, a fundamental, solution to address the conditions that allow these guys to, gain power and rise up the ranks and form different groups, even if it's another group after Hamas, I think it's still a long way from saying anything like mission accomplished.
Tom O'Connor, Newsweek.com. More on how these top Hamas leaders have evaded Israeli forces. Think back on today's event.
text delivered on the country's biggest 5G network. You can make the switch and keep the phone and number you have right now along with all of your existing contacts. You can get this new customer offer and a new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month by going to mintmobile.com/explained. That's mintmobile.com/explained. You can cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/explained. $45 upfront payment required, that is equivalent to $15 a month for 3 months. New customers, guys, on your first 3-month plan only. Speeds are slower above 40 gigabytes on that unlimited plan, and additional taxes, fees, and restrictions do apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Support for Today Explained comes from Noom. If you're striving to eat healthier, you are well aware why I'm using a word like striving. It's difficult. According to Noom, that has listed you in discipline and religion with psychology. Noom is a weight management program that focuses on the science behind food cravings and on building sustainable eating habits. Phoebe Rios is part of the Micro Shots, and she tried me in person.
Definitely recommend Noom. It is a holistic, thorough, inclusive approach to sustainable weight loss. I love how modern it is. It's easy to navigate. It's beautiful. There are fun and mystery shows. It's also heavily researched by experts and medical journals.
Noom wants to help you stay focused on what's important to you with their psychology and biology-based approach. You can sign up for a trial today at Noom.com, and you can check out Noom's first ever cookbook, The Noom Kitchen, for 100 healthy and delicious recipes to promote better living. Available to buy now wherever books are sold.
Support for this show comes from Vanta. If you're building a SaaS business, achieving compliance with SOC 2, ISO 27001, or other in-demand frameworks can unlock major growth for your company and establish customer trust. But this process can be expensive and eat up valuable time. Vanta automates your compliance work, getting you audit ready quickly and can save you up to 85% of associated costs. And Vanta can scale with your business, helping you continuously monitor compliance, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. Join 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Flow Health, and more that use Vanta to build trust and prove security in real time. You can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/Fox. That's VANTA.com/Fox.
This is Today Explained.
My name is Meirav Sunshine, and I'm the Senior Israel Analyst with the International Crisis Group.
Could you just tell us why Israel has failed to destroy top Hamas leadership?
When you kind of get down to the nitty-gritty of how the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, defines the war goals, they specifically talk about taking away the governing and military capabilities of Hamas. So even though we heard a lot of very incendiary rhetoric, destroying Hamas, destroying Gaza, all these things, when you actually break it down, they want to remove Hamas as a power in the Gaza Strip.
Hamas will be dismantled. And Hamas leaders, wherever they're hiding, should know they're on borrowed time. We will continue doing everything in our power to fulfill our mission. Free our hostages from Hamas and free Gaza from Hamas.
And they haven't been able to do that largely, and I think there's two main reasons for that. One is that it's very difficult to take apart a non-state kind of terror group that has taken root inside a very small, urban, densely populated area when they've been there for almost 20 years, and when, you know, a lot of what they do is figuring out how to defend and offend in search of resisting Israeli occupation, oppression, and also because they're not a state actor, they have to use all kinds of means to do that, including building a tunnel network.
You've got reinforced concrete, they have electrical wires, there is plumbing overhead. I'm about to fly in, you can see this is right there.
So that plus the fact that Hamas had taken many, many hostages, and to this day there are over 100 hostages still in Gaza, it seems pretty likely that the Israeli military has had a difficult time getting to Hamas leadership and key players because they are surrounded by hostages. And as much destruction and devastation and killing that we've seen, I think there would have been probably even more if those hostages weren't there and they wouldn't have to worry about that collateral damage. The other is, besides the kind of military difficulty and the urban warfare difficulty before October 7th and the criticism since October 7th of the Netanyahu government and Netanyahu specifically, was that he had a very clear policy of keeping Hamas in power and also trying to contain Hamas in a way, because Hamas is a very good excuse for Israel to continue on settlement expansion and occupation and rejection of the Palestinian state, rejection of Palestinian self-determination, because we're talking about a terror group that many in the world don't think is legitimate.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pushed back today against criticism of his Gaza strategy from within his own government. Israel's defense minister accused Netanyahu of indecision and leading Israel down a dangerous course.
Indecision is, in essence, a decision. This leads to a dangerous course, which promotes the idea of Israeli military and civilian governance in Gaza. This is a negative and dangerous option for the state of Israel, strategically, militarily, and from a security standpoint. We must make tough decisions for the future of our country, making national priorities above considerations, even with the possibility of personal or political costs.
So he kind of kept Hamas there for a long time, and in some ways maybe still has an interest in keeping Hamas at play somewhat, even though that is, of course, counterintuitive or productive to what Israel wants, what Israel is saying it wants. But as long as Hamas is there, Israel doesn't have to get into any kind of peace process, any kind of serious political negotiation. Doesn't have to take the Palestinian demands for a state, for liberation, for rights as seriously, let's say. And specifically, even if we assume that Netanyahu to getting rid of Hamas, he has an interest in staying in power now, and the best way to stay in power is to keep the war going on and on and on.
Has it worked at all? Have they got to any of Hamas's top leadership?
They've gotten to some of, I think, the more senior commanders in charge of certain aspects of the military wing of Hamas.
They've broken a significant number of Hamas battalions, killed thousands of Hamas fighters, including senior commanders. Hamas's number 3, Marwan Issa, was killed in an Israeli operation last week. The rest of the top leaders are in hiding, likely deep in the Hamas tunnel network.
You know, they've had like these tactical achievements throughout the war. We took out this guy, we took out that guy, he was responsible for this, but nobody in the inner circle that makes the decisions, nobody, I think, in the immediate, 5 people with Sinwar. And they really are very much interested in getting to those people, not just because they're the people making the decisions, but because of this feeling of revenge that they need to take these people out in order to have at least a symbolic victory.
It sounds like you're saying that it's not really plausible to just fully eradicate Hamas. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's a few reasons for that. I mean, first of all, you have the strongest military in the Middle East fighting for 8 months now, almost, and I think something like some of the U.S. military intelligence numbers and reports that have come out talk about maybe 30% of Hamas militants. Also, we don't know exactly how they categorize what a Hamas militant is, but even if we take higher numbers that Israel gives, let's say half of the casualties, which is over 35,000, and let's say half of those are Hamas militants, it's still not, a number that can really take apart an organization necessarily. Now, maybe it's enough to not allow Hamas to operate as a military anymore, not enable it to attack Israeli border communities anymore. That's possible, and I think again, the war goals and the rhetoric were way, way higher than they could have made good on. They promised things that they just couldn't deliver on, and so if they had also made the war goals a bit more realistic at the beginning, then the achievements that they've had until now may have looked different.
How does the United States feel about Israel's strategy with Hamas at this point?
I mean, in some ways, Biden, has been talking lately a little bit out of, at 2 parts of his mouth. The U.S. has fully supported Israel diplomatically, politically, economically, militarily throughout this war.
So in this moment, we must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. And we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself.
It also purportedly, supports Israel's war goals of getting the hostages back and destroying Hamas. Like it's full on agrees with Israel's decision to go out to this war, but how it's waged its war is where, you know, certain former generals and certain Biden administration people have said, like, we could do it in a different way.
I don't think the two things are incompatible. You know, I think you can conduct military operations effectively and also account for civilians in the battle space. There are ways to do this where you can account for both. You can protect the people and also accomplish your objectives.